This is Ralph Fusatola, JD. I'm a president of the Institute for Health Research. This is part of our Emergency Health Summit about COVID-19, the Chinese coronavirus, which is spreading around the world. I have as my guest on this section of our marathon, Larry Becraft, an attorney from Alabama who I've known for many years. Larry is, in my estimation, the dean of the Patriot lawyers. He is well known, and he is an expert on some of the issues that we all have to face today. And those issues include martial law, forced quarantine, forced vaccination, and they go back to issues in the Constitution and in the case law. So Larry, where do you want to start in helping people understand their legal rights in an era of pandemic and government overreach?
Well, let's start off with a popular topic that there's a lot of misconceptions about, and that relates to martial law. For years, there's been a lot of people been talking about martial law, and there's all sorts of wild, baseless theories out there about what is martial law. And to me, if you're looking at these events that may be unfolding over the next 3-4 months, 6 months, maybe even a year, there's going to be some politicians, other power brokers who are going to be using this crisis to increase greatly the control of government over the American populace. Yesterday, I watched a little video. There's this lady, blonde-haired, I think she's Canadian. She was making a podcast that deals with what's the events that are happening in China right now. And, you got to have your smartphone. You walk into a subway station, you got to use your smartphone to get, approval to get past. If you have a green color on your smartphone, you can go places. If you got a red or some other color, no, you're condemned. That's what they're going through in China. And I can see that this crisis is going to be used to ratchet up the controls that we have here in the United States. Now, martial law would be something that a lot of Americans would think, well, this is the way that they're going to do it here in America. Well, there's a great misconception about what is martial law. And if you go back to the Civil War era, we have a Supreme Court case that deals directly with this issue. Martial law is not something that is new. You've had for thousands of years governments that wanted to exercise tyrannical control over the populations that they govern. Well, the same thing has happened in England. Our legal history is, based upon England's common law. Our legal histories flow from the practices of England back in those days. However, there was a time for tyrants in the past in England. And, during the Revolutionary War, we were being subjected to some of those tyrannical practices.
Right. Drumhead trials, as they used to call them.
That is true. There's a lot of people that want to sit, I hear these arguments, oh, the common law this, the common law that, the common law is God's law. I have a disagreement there about whether or not the common law is biblically based. There are aspects of the common law that are. However, there's a lot of the common law that isn't. The common law was really just a form of, you go back into the time when law had to be passed around and understood because, we didn't have any books. We didn't have the printing press.
Right.
It was all an oral tradition. The common law, was a rural society. But nonetheless, we inherited that. A lot of people want to say the common law is biblically based, but I will say this, the first attack here in the United States on the common law happened by means of the United States Constitution. If you look at the first 8 amendments, those amendments condemned established legal practices back in those days.
Right.
They were established by the common law. So the
And those
first,
were practices that were allowed in the wording of the Constitution, which is why the Bill of Rights was necessary to
absolutely,
protect us
absolutely.
from the very government created by the Constitution.
So, I don't want people to sit there and say, oh, let's go back to the common law when we're dealing with this subject of martial law. But let's get right down to the basic matters. Back during the Civil War, there was a case that got generated that went to the United States Supreme Court. And in this case, Ex Parte Milligan, the Supreme Court took the opportunity to really outline what is martial law and, in essence, tell us what it is today. There's a lot of historical writers that have written on the subject of martial law. You can, I even looked yesterday to see how many, historical documents are posted on the internet. There's a good bit of sources. But if you really want to study this subject in detail, I would suggest you get on the internet and look around for articles published by, typically on News with Views, articles published by Dr. Edwin Vieira, who's a friend of mine I've known for 30 plus years.
Brilliant.
Edwin Vieira has written a lot about, this topic. He wrote, I like his book, Pieces of Eight, which deals with money issue. But then he's written a lot of other books dealing with the Second Amendment. But, he's also dealt with, this explanation of or trying to popularize our view of what martial law is about. So in addition to what I may be saying today, if you want to really delve into this subject, just do a word search on the internet. Don't use Google. Type in Dr. Edwin Vieira, News with Views, and that'll give you a link to that News with Views page where he's got tons and tons of articles that he's written.
So answer some
and you
questions
can pick them and see what he has to say about martial law.
So answer some questions for me.
All
Is
right.
there anything in the Constitution, are the words martial law used anywhere in the U.S. Constitution?
Absolutely not. Hey, the Declaration of Independence was the American colonies were being subjected to martial law almost. Back during the time of the Revolutionary War, we engaged in that war because of the implementation of martial law. So the Declaration of Independence is a condemnation of martial law. And then when you take a look at the United States Constitution, the powers that are expressed therein, those people that wrote the Constitution, having just thrown off martial law, weren't going to give the power of martial law to the new federal Congress or to the new United States of America.
But there is a clause in there that says that the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended.
Yeah, but that's entirely different from, martial law.
All right.
There may be, we had the Civil War.
Well, and if there is any martial law power, it must be somehow in that Constitution. And when those 8 amendments were adopted, I presume that those 8 amendments limit any power of martial law.
Well, let's talk about and explain first what is martial law.
Please.
And, there's a lot of writers, historical writers, that have gotten into the subject of what is martial law. But in essence, here's the way the legal theories and ideas and parameters about martial law here in America will be based upon this case called Ex Parte Milligan. Now, what is this case about? Milligan was an Indianan, and he and a bunch of other Indianans in about 1864, I think it's October of 1864, they got charged with, they were doing something that the martial authorities in Indiana didn't like. So the martial authorities brought martial charges against a group of men for conspiracy and other things, trying to overthrow the government of the United States and blah, blah, blah. They were charged with offenses that carried the penalty of death. And in fact, they went through these military proceedings. It was a court martial in essence. And, a lot of them were sentenced to death, but then the death penalty didn't get carried out because it got commuted. But nonetheless, it was a case that, the patriots of of that time, like we are today, they came around Milligan's case, and it went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And something I really like about the Ex parte Milligan case is this Milligan's lawyer. And Milligan's lawyer, I don't know, sometimes, Ralph, you can show, it is what I'm showing on the screen. I've got an item up, Black's Arguments in Milligan. I don't know whether you can see that or we have to do something else. You can't see that?
Share screen. I think you can share screens with us, I believe.
Yeah, well, let's not worry about it. All I want to do. Milligan was represented by this guy by the name of Jeremiah Black. And that case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And if you go over to John Rowland's, the Constitutions.org website, and do a search for Black's Arguments in Milligan, that's what I sent to him. That's the name of the file.
Okay.
That I sent to John for him to post on Constitution.org website. So if you just type in Black's Arguments in Milligan, MILLIGAN.PDF, that is posted on John Rowland's website. But sitting down and reading this 35-page argument of Jeremiah Black, it's just profound. People need to read it. Here's one of my favorite quotes from the case. All history proves that public officials and public officers of any government, when they are engaged in a severe struggle to retain their places, become bitter and ferocious and hate those who oppose them, even in the most legitimate way, with a rancor which they never exhibit towards actual crime. This kind of malignity vents itself in prosecutions for political offenses, sedition, conspiracy, libel, and treason, and the charges are generally founded upon the information of hirelings, spies, and common delators who make merchandise of their oaths and trade in the blood of their fellow men. That's just,
and the
one of
Supreme Court
the...
fought the argument.
Well, he was just making the argument. Here they are at the Supreme Court. They, he's representing a guy that's been, tried by military authorities and sentenced to death. And he's at the Supreme Court saying, hey, man, this whole proceeding, there was no jurisdiction for a military tribunal to try Milligan. And to make a long story short, let's get to the point, because there's some other things we need to cover in this, 20 minutes to 30 minutes that we're going to devote to this today. The Supreme Court reached this conclusion that, martial law is the form of law. It's the law of necessity. It is the type of, quote, law that would arise from the complete vacuum of any other type of law. And the Supreme Court, in essence, said that martial law is only that law when you have a military in the field. There's actual war going on. When that is happening, hey, there's no other law. The only law that there is the law of the military. However, if, the civil government is in power, if the courts are open and, you don't have a military in the field, then martial law cannot be the law in effect. So just using these basic principles manifested, what the Supreme Court wrote about, their decision in the Milligan case holds that, what people think is martial law cannot be implemented in this country. That's the definition of martial law.
Let me give you a for instance, and ask for your opinion about it. In this, for instance, the coronavirus is not, today 14 people are dead in the United States. Let's say in a month, there are 14,000 people who are dead. Let us say that the United States Health Services, which are uniformed services, we have a Surgeon General, and we have uniformed health services, which are indeed those services. And we have an army that's in the field enforcing citywide curfews and quarantine. And the courts have been turned off. The courts have been shut down, as have all public places of public accommodation. And we now have that situation in this country. And the government has ruled that everyone must be vaccinated with a new coronavirus vaccine, which actually has never been tested because there's no time to test it. And they're going door to door. What is the law that applies? Can you be, like in China, where we've seen the videos of people being dragged from their homes? Can Americans be forced out of their homes into confinement and forced to be vaccinated? Does the 1905 case about vaccines go that far?
Well, hey, Ralph, this is what I see happening. And this is where people are going to have to get informed about these basic principles ahead of time. You know, like this, we're talking about martial law now, and we don't want to have people have different ideas about martial law. However, I can also see that this thinking can be carried away, and there can be situations that may happen in the next 6 to 8 months where we do have that. You know, we have people roaming the streets, they're pretending to be public officials, and they're going to say, hey, we're going to force you to take this vaccine. Mm-hmm. That is a possibility. But, when you have a situation like that happening, there's not going to be anything the law can do after the fact.
That's interesting.
It's going to have to be prepared ahead of time. And, but that's the nature of the American people, is to just sit back, not prepare. And then when something like this comes around, they're going to be subjected to that if we don't have a team ready for the attack.
That's a very important point. I appreciate that. We're in a situation where our courts have held over and over again that vaccines are, quote, unavoidably unsafe. And we know the general legal principle of informed consent tells us that where there is risk, there must be consent. And so basically the law is very much on the side of those of us who say we don't want that treatment. I certainly can understand that, especially when the treatment is prophylactic and not retrospective. So that's where we are at the moment. What do you think people should prepare for? How do you self-quarantine? Or the proper phrase is self-shield. If there's a pandemic going on, and what happened in 1918 and 1919 in the United States during the great flu pandemic that killed 500,000 Americans. 10 times more Americans died in 1918 and 1919 from the flu than died on the battlefields of World War I. So that's what was the law. We know a few years before that, there was a famous case of Jacobson versus Massachusetts, in which the Supreme Court said it was okay for a state to fine someone $5. In those days, $5, I guess, equivalent of $25 today, for not getting a flu vaccine during a flu pandemic. But the court also said in that case, very importantly, the courts are not without power. I love that double negative they play. The courts are not without power in such situations where it can be shown or reasonably proven that this particular person is not a fit subject for vaccination, or the vaccination might probably harm the person. And that's what that case says. Does that still apply? Is that still law? And remember, I'm asking that in the context of 1905 is 5 or 6 years before the first informed consent case, the famous New York State case by Justice, where he said that it's a trespass. It's an assault and battery to impose a medical treatment on someone without their informed consent. What is the law today?
Well, Ralph, these events that we're contemplating may happen in the future. If there's not an organization set up to respond to it, then it's been my experience that when you have a force that is walking around in a community, doing something like this, then chances are they're going to get their way. And the only way that you'll be able to stop that is either physical resistance, or there's going to have to be a group of people that are going to have to go to bat and go to court and try to and join things. This is the same old battle that's been going on in reference to vaccines.
Exactly.
And now it's going to be
for a minute that Congress basically passes a resolution authorizing, giving the president emergency authority during the pandemic, that basically the effect of the resolution is to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. That is, the government can hold someone without a court being able to review it. Does the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, which is as close as we can get, I think, to martial law in this current situation, does that suspend my First Amendment right to speak or my First Amendment right to associate? Does it suspend my Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms? Those are the questions. Those are the practical questions we're dealing with.
Oh, yeah. But here's where I see this headed, Ralph.
Go ahead.
I don't see Uncle Sam coming along. We need people to understand something about the limits of martial law. We also need to have people understand, the national emergencies. At the federal level, if you go back to the Trading with the Enemy Act in 1917, I got enacted in 1917. It dealt with, events arising out of World War I. But then it got modified in 1933 to allow for the seizure of, gold and gold. And, there's a body of law that rolls out of all of that. And the statutes that relate to that are in Title 50 United States Code, the Title 50 Appendix, United States Code. I don't see Uncle Sam doing anything more than maybe doing something with the, in reference to national emergencies, which if you take a look at the statutes themselves, they're limited. And, there's a whole subject where we could, there's a lot of discussion that could be carried on about the limits of, the national emergency laws. But what I do see is like what happened today. Congress comes along and passes an $8 billion authorization. And that's exactly what Congress is going to do. They're going to give money to the states, and then the states like, Gavin Newsom, out there in California,
People's Republic of California.
They're going to be the ones, it'll be the state will have more authority to do something about this than the federales. And so I see the federales providing the funding for the states to come along and, having the media scare all of the public officials in the states. And then they have the federales running around to state officials and telling them, oh, you need to do this, that, and the other. The chances are the state officials are going to do what the federales say. And so it's going to be state power that's going to be used to do these things. And I don't see, absent almost armed opposition to this, I see a lot of Americans coming along and, folding to it, if they do things like they're doing in China. I don't know whether you've seen those videotapes, but I've seen the people that are, locked up in their high-rise condominiums and things like that, and they're jumping off, and then they're having doors blocked by truckloads of dirt put in the door to, basically barricading people inside buildings. You have that in your larger cities. It's going to be, that's going to be only a small part. You could do that in, in some places in Miami, New York, Chicago, maybe Denver and St. Louis and maybe Houston and Los Angeles
and San Francisco. But,
but the rest of the country, they're not going to be able to do that type of stuff. What I do see is, they're going to be using social media. They're going to be implementing greater police state controls over the population, and they may get around to doing things like, hey, Ralph, there may be a way that they can convince the American people to voluntarily take these flu shots.
That's
and
true.
I think that's,
but back in 2009, during the famous swine flu pandemic, which never happened, they had people basically rejected the vaccine. For example, they only had 50,000 doses for the whole city of Boston. They were arranging for, huge lines of people, yellow barriers. Everything was set up to prepare for the onslaught. You better line up a day in advance to get your vaccine. 500 people in the entire city showed up for the vaccine. People rejected the vaccine and there was no pandemic. Now it's a decade later and the conditioning has been much stronger. So my thought to you is, and we only have a couple of minutes left, what is your summary? You said we have to be prepared to take legal action in advance because we're not going to have time when it comes. And I agree with
Well,
you.
the first thing,
Really good lawyers like yourself and others who are talking around the country about these issues. And that's a real important first step.
well, I would suggest that a lot of people do what I said at the outset. Take a look at some of Edwin Vieira's articles about the limits of martial law. But then again, even if you don't do that, understand that the limits of martial law are contrary to what people popular perceive martial law to be. If we're going to be looking at in the future some police state tactics being implemented, like goon squads going around, and attacking people and doing various things like we have seen in China, they just walk up to somebody and throw them in a car. And, here in America, the only way that we're going to have to address that is two ways: armed revolt, which I don't think a lot of people are going to want to do. But then, if we're not going to do that, then we need to be prepared with having a strategy for fielding a legal team to bring an attack on all this.
Very good.
And, but then again, that's what we need for a lot of areas in American law. And, I just hope that the American people will
let it happen. I see over your shoulder what looks to me like Rembrandt's Night Watch.
Yes.
Of the people armed to protect their rights.
That is true. That is true.
That's really where we are at the moment. We all know that the vaccines don't work. If anything, they trigger the pandemics, and we know that that pushing people into enclosed areas simply spreads the disease. And so everything we're being offered by the authorities is worse than nothing. And we appreciate your drawing our attention to the legal ramifications. And indeed, we do need a flying team of lawyers to be ready to approach these issues if it comes to that. Thank you, Larry Becraft. You're an attorney who I greatly respect. And
same here, Ralph. I've enjoyed it. Let's get the word out.
All right, we'll get the word out. We'll stop this recording.